The bell over Ember Dais rang once, and the sound cut through wool, armor, and bone like a blade drawn slow from a sheath. 9 council seats stood in a crescent above the floor, all occupied except the central one left empty for judgment. Tallow candles sweated onto iron sconces and ran in pale rivulets down blackened stone. Snowmelt dripped from cloaks onto the floor and spread in dark fans that reflected the firelight in broken shapes. A hawk with one pale eye rode the rafters in a tight, waiting loop, wing beats soft as cloth. Orion stood on the lower step with his hands open at his sides. No sword, no gloves, no sigil ring. A raw line marked his left palm where he had cut himself on a saddle buckle that morning and refused bandaging because he wanted nothing between skin and choice. His shoulders were square, but he looked worn down at the edges, beard shadow too dark for the hour, eyes rimmed from 4 nights without real sleep. Tamsin faced him from 3 paces away, boots planted on the old brass inlay, where old laws were spoken aloud. Her right glove rested on her belt, empty, the worn leather curled at the fingers from years of use. The Chancellor's seal had already been broken in public. The iron claim had already been read and challenged. Witnesses had already heard arguments until voices frayed. One last line remained. Orion's voice was low, rough at the edges from argument and restraint. No statute binds me now. No office compels this. I ask as myself. He swallowed once, hard, and said the words that had burned through a year of discipline. Will you stand with me, beyond treaty, beyond victory, beyond war? Before she answered, before the hawk stooped, before the room learned what free consent looked like, the bell's echo rolled back across 1 year and carried them to the first time everyone laughed. In 1279, the same bell rang over polished stone and smug mouths. At the center of the crescent sat High Chancellor Vey, fingers jeweled, smile precise as a stitch pulled too tight. He wore white fur at the collar, though spring heat had reached the valley, and he sat as if the chair had been carved specifically to frame his authority. Orion Darkhollow stood at the war table to Vey's right in black scale and plain leather, fortress air by blood, and war led by necessity, posture straight enough to look carved from basalt. A clerk read statutes from a silver tube, voice pitched for ceremony instead of clarity. Captains in river-stained cloaks shifted for better sightlines. Nobles leaned in with bright, hungry faces already anticipating spectacle. Along the outer wall, scribes sharpened quills and arranged fresh parchment for the record. Under emergency war authority, the clerk said, voice climbing to please power. The iron claim binds command pairings deemed essential to state continuity. Vey lifted one hand and 2 guards opened the side doors. Tamsin Vale walked in alone. She wore no court silk, only a dark riding coat with river mud still dried at the hem and a satchel strapped crosswise over her shoulder. The coat had been mended at one cuff with tight, practical stitches. Her hair was braided close and pinned with 2 brass needles. Ink had stained the side of her thumb and the edge of her index finger, where she habitually steadied rulers while marking maps. She looked not at Vey first, and not at the seats watching her, but at the campaign map stretched across the oak table, its rivers drawn in tidy blue, its swamps left as blank green smudges where uncertainty had been treated like empty land. Laughter started in the top tier before the clerk finished reading her appointment. A thin, rolling sound, like cloth being torn in strips and passed hand to hand. Vey did not raise his voice. He never needed to. By the iron claim, you are attached to Lord Orion's War Council as political liaison and advisory tether. Advisory tether. The phrase had been chosen in advance for public sting. A steward dragged a backless stool from the wall and set it below table level, off-center, where she would have to crane her neck to see the map and twist sideways to reach notes. The legs screeched across stone. One captain slapped his knee. Another asked loudly whether they were arming surveyors now and if ink could stop cavalry. A third muttered, not quietly enough, that Vey had brought a clerk's daughter to a battlefield argument. Tamsin put her satchel down by that humiliating stool and did not sit. She adjusted the satchel strap once, steady, and stepped onto the low rung placed beside the table for map access. Orion watched her cross to the assigned place. His face gave nothing away, but his thumb tapped once against the edge of the table, a tiny strike he likely did not know he made. Vey missed it. She did not. When she stepped up onto the low rung to see the map, the rung shifted on uneven stone. Her ankle rolled hard, her body tilted. Orion moved on instinct, hand coming out to catch her wrist. The hall drums struck oath time at that exact beat. 3 heavy thuds, then 2. Skins reverberating through the wood frame beneath everyone's feet. He stopped a breath from her skin, fingers curled in empty air, held there by discipline and by the timing of ritual. She found her balance herself, straightened and looked up. He held her eyes a moment too long for strangers, not long enough for scandal, exactly long enough for every attentive witness to mark a line drawn and not crossed. Vey smiled wider, sensing tension but reading it wrong. "Begin," he said. A map weight shaped like a crouching wolf held down the northeast corner. Tamsin leaned in, scanning contour marks, road glyphs, supply symbols, weather notations. She saw what no one else was looking for. Old flood scars denoted by faint hatch marks beneath official ink. The main river, the Var, had shifted channels twice in 10 years, and the official chart had flattened those scars into decorative memory. She spoke into the room still full of smirks. "If the northern host feigns retreat here," she touched a bend with her stained thumb, "their wagons can vanish behind this old bank and hit our flank at the ford. It is a river feint." A captain barked a laugh before she finished. "From hatch marks? Lady, those are survey remnants." She turned to Orion, not to the captain. "Those remnants are year stamps. 1273 and 1275 floods, deep-cut channels. Their cavalry can hide there until dawn mist." Vey tapped his ring on wood, the jewel making a hard click. "Noted and dismissed. We have scout reports." As if summoned by contempt, a shadow dropped from the rafters. Kestrel, one-eyed and slate-feathered, landed on the war standard over the dais. The staff jerked under talons. 3 handlers in livery rushed with gloves and whistles. The hawk flattened, hissed, and snapped, refusing all 3, feathers bristling high along his neck. The room rippled with startled curses and awkward laughter that broke quickly into irritation. Tamsin did not flinch. She gave one soft clicking sound with her tongue and held her glove up for half a second, just enough for Kestrel to see, then lowered it before he could launch. She would not ask for mercy in that room, from bird or man. "Remove that bird," Vey said through clenched teeth. No one removed him. Kestrel shifted his grip once, talons scraping fabric wrap, and stayed until the convocation ended. Then he departed through an arrow slit in a clean, unhurried glide, as if attendance had been his right. By dusk, rain started. The lower corridors smelled of damp wool, lamp oil, and wet leather. Water beaded along carved lintels and dripped from chains into clay catch bowls. The night council met in a map chamber no wider than a wagon lane, with a slate board on one wall and pins driven into wood at measured intervals. 8 men and 1 woman had been at the public table. Now only 3 remained inside: Orion, Tamsin, and Sable Rook, quartermaster and Orion's oldest ally, broad-shouldered, blunt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Sable dropped 2 sacks of tally sticks onto the table with a clatter that made the ink pots jump. "Scout returns by hour, grain load by mule, arrow bundles by company." Also complaints from everyone who thinks rain is a personal attack. He looked at Tamsin like a man judging the edge on a new blade, skeptical, practical, willing to test under pressure. Orion set a candle near her maps and shielded the flame with his hand until it steadied. Show me the floodplain argument again. No laughter now. No chancellor. No audience hungry for humiliation. Tamsin unrolled her own sheets, stitched parchment patched at corners, lines marked with charcoal, red, and diluted ink. The papers smelled faintly of cedar, ink gum, and old smoke from nights spent mapping near campfires. In the margin of one page, tiny script noted depth readings from M. Vale ledgers. Her mother's survey hand transcribed into her own, each number copied twice for certainty. She placed a pebble on the main ford and 3 nails along the old bank. Their supply column moves heavy. If they fake retreat west, we follow. They split south in shallow dawn water here and here. We'll see campfires where we expect them, but that's bait. Orion bent over beside her. He smelled of cold iron and wood smoke, and rain darkened the cuffs of his shirt. Every time he shifted, the table edge pressed against her hip because the room was too narrow for comfortable distance, and too busy for either of them to acknowledge it. She felt each footfall through floorboards before she heard it. Her pulse learned his pacing count. 5 steps from slate wall to map shelf, turn, 5 back. She could track him without looking. He stopped at her shoulder. Warmth from his body touched the side of her neck without contact. Sable watched both of them, took in the current in the room, and decided to keep his eyes on numbers. Scout tally says 2,000 North host total, Sable said. At least, and that is probably low. Not in one body, Tamsin replied. She tapped the sticks. Read me the returns from the willow cut pickets. All watches, not just dawn summary. Sable thumbed through damp pages and read aloud, rough voice flattening names into usable data. Third watch, dust plumes at Upper Trail, maybe 600. Before dawn, hoof impressions near Reed Flats, count uncertain. Midday, no wagon signatures at Main Road. Late bell, smoke seen West Bank, no movement confirmed. She built casualty math as he spoke, shifting pebbles into 3 groups. If 600 visible and no wagons on road, then wagons masked. They aim to force us into the narrow ford. Casualties if we commit front first? She looked at Orion. He answered without hesitation. Too high. How high? 700 in first hour if the bank collapses underweight. More if panic starts behind the second rank. She nodded once. Then we deny them line of sight at the ford and pull back to higher ground before dawn. Sable crossed his arms, jaw tight. That means yielding 2 villages overnight. People there will think we abandoned them. It means not turning those villages into a battlefield with our own dead in the lanes, she said. Evacuation runners go now, and we hold the ridge long enough for carts. Orion stood very still, then dragged a chalk line on the slate with hard pressure. No frontal pursuit at Var Bend. We reposition to Ridge 9. Sable, mark movement windows by company strength. The chalk snapped in his fingers. He tossed the broken piece aside and took another. When Sable left to wake runners and curse the stairs under his breath, the room quieted except for rain-tapping shutters and the steady hiss of candlewick. Orion remained by the table, hands braced on wood. You took every blow on that dais and didn't blink, he said. I blinked, she said. I just did it inward. A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. You don't need to stand on that lower rung again. I know. She rolled her map, tied it, then met his eyes full on. But I will, until they stop pretending I don't belong at the height. He held her gaze, nodded once, like a vow accepted and stored. Over the next 6 days, the council split its hours between the public chamber and the narrow night room. Publicly, Vey steered attention toward his favored route through Stonewash Pass and praised its noble directness, while skimming over supply strain. Privately, Orion asked for fresh casualty projections every dawn and let Tamsin challenge every assumption spoken at the table. Sable kept feeding them numbers from grain carts, horse feed, arrow counts, axle failures, and mule loss, because no plan survived contact with hunger. Twice, Vey attempted to block her access to the main map chest by citing documentation hierarchy. Twice, Orion overruled him on command authority grounds without raising his voice. The first time, murmurs spread. The second, they did not. On the seventh night, the storm broke. Moonlight threaded through cloud and cast silver bars across the map vault floor, where rolled campaign skins were shelved in cedar racks. They had come down after midnight to compare old river surveys to current scout sketches, because no one else in the chamber trusted old flood data enough to do it thoroughly. The vault door stood half open for air. Beyond it, corridor torches had burned low and gone to orange coals. Tamsin reached for a tube on the top shelf. Orion stepped behind her and took it down before she needed the ladder. His forearm brushed her shoulder. Both of them froze for one beat, then continued as if nothing had happened. He spread the tube's contents on the table, a faded flood chart from 1271, ink browned with age and creases softened by handling. She pinned corners with iron weights. He set a lamp closer, and flame lit the line of a scar on his jaw she had not noticed before. "Where did that come from?" she asked, touching her own jaw in mirror of the mark. "South Parapet, age 17, he said. Missed a handhold in rain. Tried to pretend it was strategic. You fall often? Only once, where anyone saw." She laughed quietly, surprising herself with the sound in that room. The laugh bounced off cedar and stone and returned softer. He watched her mouth as if the laugh had altered gravity. "Tamsin." Her name and his voice made every nerve along her ribs tighten. She kept both palms on the map to anchor herself. "Yes?" He took a breath that shook at the end. "I want you, beyond treaty, beyond victory. No title. No strategic framing, raw and direct." She did not step toward him, did not give him an easy answer in the dark simply because they had both been waiting. "If you want me," she said, each word measured, "then you can want me while I argue with you in front of men who call me Tether. You can want me when it costs you comfort." His answer came without delay. "I already do." He lifted his hand, paused a finger width from her wrist in an echo of the oath-time almost touch, then dropped it to the table instead. They worked another hour shoulder to shoulder, marking channels and timing routes. Hunger stayed in the room like banked heat, present and controlled. Morning brought an emergency council session called before breakfast. Vey had new accusations, delivered in a tone of offended governance. Delays, insubordination, political contamination of command. He wanted Orion censured for diverting cavalry from his favored pass and implied sabotage without naming source. Sable arrived late, boots muddy to the ankle, carrying 2 bound logbooks with wax tabs. He did not bow deeply enough for Vey's taste. "Quartermaster," Vey snapped, "state why supply transfers occurred without my authorization." Sable set both books on the table, opened to marked pages, and turned them toward the council. "Because your authorization arrived 3 days after the wagons moved, signed for grain that never existed in those depots." Murmurs broke across the 9 seats. 2 clerks leaned forward at once. Vey's smile thinned to paper. "Are you alleging sabotage?" "I'm alleging arithmetic." Sable jabbed a calloused finger at columns of figures. "Your office claimed 1,200 sacks at East Granary. Actual count was 409. Same hand certified both. Same seal pressure on both, too. If we had followed your route through Stonewash, half the rear companies would have marched on empty ration by day 4. Orion leaned in, eyes on numbers. Tamsin looked not at Vey, but at the seals, noting duplicate crest impressions where one stamp had been reheated and reused. She said, clearly enough for every seat, "The Chancellor's sabotage claim against Field Command is false. The logs disprove it." Vey pointed at her as if she were dirt tracked into a hall. You exceed your station. Station does not change a ledger total, she said. The council split in plain view. 4 seats sided with Vey, 3 with Orion. 1 abstained. 1 demanded battlefield proof before granting broader command authority. The tie held for 48 dangerous hours while rain rose and scouts returned with contradictory smoke reports. Then week 3 of the 1,280 campaign arrived, and the river did what her mother's ledgers said it would. At dusk on day 19, low clouds sat over the floodplain like wool packed into a wound. Tamsin stood on a ridge marker stone with Orion and Sable beside her. Wind drove damp reeds flat in shifting bands. Below, the Var split around reeds and old channels hidden under sedge and silt. Fires from the north host burned in a convincing retreat line to the west. Too tidy, too evenly spaced, too eager to be seen. Too clean, she said. They want us looking there. Orion raised a spyglass, scanned, and passed it to Sable. Confirm South Bank movement. Sable watched for a long 10 counts, then 15. There, no torches. Wagon wheels wrapped in cloth. They're ghosting east. Tamsin dropped to one knee and drew the 3-vector ambush in wet soil with a knife tip. Rain had softened the ground enough that the lines held. Vector 1, she said, carving a line along the ridge. Archers on high bank, staggered every 20 paces. No fire until my signal. Keep reserve bundles dry under canvas until third call. She stabbed the blade 14 measured inches across the dirt map. Vector 2 crosses 14 miles overnight through the dry gully. Light infantry only. No wagons, no heavy shields. They hit masked wagons at dawn from the rear and cut trace lines before teams can turn. Her knife curved to the ford and old cut. Vector 3 feints retreat at main crossing, draws their cavalry into the old channel, then collapses the bank with pre-placed charges and controlled release. Sable grunted approval despite himself. Mean. Efficient, she corrected. Orion crouched opposite her, rain beating on his lashes, cloak dark with damp. Casualty projection? If timing holds, we preserve 1,200 of ours who would die in a frontal push. Maybe more if surrender lanes stay open. He looked at her for one hard second, reading confidence and risk side by side, then stood. Signal companies by color code, move now. Night swallowed columns as they moved. Boots sank in mud. Harness buckles were wrapped in cloth to mute clink. Horses snorted steam into cold dark. Runners moved bent low, passing hand signs when voice would carry. At mile 5 through the gully, the lead rope on one mule team snapped and nearly dragged 3 men down slope. Sable cursed, rewove the line with spare tack, and kept them moving. At mile 8, one platoon lost pace in a slide, but he rerouted rear mules to haul them up without breaking silence. At mile 11, a scout returned with cut palms from bramble and reported enemy pickets sleeping under oilcloth farther north than expected, opening a cleaner lane. At mile 14, infantry reached the reed line just as dawn paled and mist rose off standing water. Tamsin waited on the ridge with 2 signal flags and a horn. Orion stood at her left, sword still sheathed, because if this worked, steel would matter less than timing and position. Kestrel rode a high thermal once, then vanished into cloud, unseen but present to her in the pattern of waiting. When enemy cavalry poured into the old cut chasing the feint, she dropped the black flag. Engineers kicked wedges free upstream. Stored water tore through rotten banks. Mud wall and current hit the channel at once, swallowing horse legs, ripping saddles loose, breaking formation where momentum had been their advantage. Men shouted for footing instead of charge. She raised the red flag. Ridge archers loosed in staggered bands, not volleys, sustaining pressure and forcing shields up in uneven rhythm. East infantry struck wagons from behind and set axle grease alight. Smoke lifted in straight gray columns and then bent south with wind. Orion gave 3 short horn calls for capture lanes at the center break. Sable's runners relayed spacing by pennant. North Host units, cut from supplies and unable to regroup in mud, began dropping arms in clusters. Where resistance held, Orion redirected line pressure to flank and contained, rather than crushed. By noon, the North Host Center had shattered into 3 disconnected knots. By mid-afternoon, the largest knot surrendered under white cloth tied to a broken spear. At sunset, casualty sheets came in, damp and smudged. Names doubled for confirmation. "Read it," Orion said, voice stripped down to command and fatigue. Sable read from the page, voice thick. Projected dead from frontal forward, 1,200. Actual dead and missing, 187. Wounded, 309. Most recoverable if surgeons keep dry tents. A long exhale moved through everyone within earshot. Men sat where they stood. One wept behind his gauntlet from relief and exhaustion and did not bother hiding it. Orion did not celebrate first. He turned to Tamsin and touched 2 fingers to his brow in formal acknowledgement before anyone else could frame the victory as his alone. "Your plan," he said. "Your math." Word ran faster than horses. By the time they returned to Emberdeus 3 days later, every tier was packed. The same cracked bell hung over the same stone. The same 9 seats held witnesses who had laughed in 1279 and were quieter now. This time, no stool waited below table height. Vey tried to control ceremony with clipped instructions and procedural objections, but the room no longer leaned toward him by default. Orion stood and requested Strategist presentation protocol under wartime performance clause. 3 seats objected, 5 approved, 1 abstained, majority held. The ritual bell rang. Tamsin stepped to the center map with her annotated chart of the Var floodplain pinned beneath crystal weights. Kestrel circled the rafters above, one-eyed arc slicing candle smoke, then settled briefly on a beam where light caught the silver at his throat. She presented the ambush in exact sequence: ridge archer spacing, 14-mile gully march timing, bank collapse trigger, capture lane intervals. She named preserved troop numbers without embellishment. 1,200 lives remained in line because we did not spend them to satisfy reputation. No one laughed. One captain who had mocked hatch marks rose halfway from his seat and bowed his head toward her, a small public surrender of old contempt. Vey attempted recovery with procedural steel. Successful outcomes do not excuse breaches. Sable stood before being recognized. Then, let procedure account for your false sabotage claim. He carried the same 2 logbooks, now copied and witnessed by all 9 council clerks overnight. Each page marked with attestation knots and fresh wax. He opened to inventory columns, depot stamps, delayed orders, and transport routes. "State it plain," Orion said. Sable did. "The accusation that Field Command diverted supplies for personal gain is false. The records show your office created paper stock that did not exist and attempted to route us through scarcity." Vey's jaw flexed. "Forgery." Tamsin slid a sheet beside the books. Scout tally recitations cross-checked to ration burn rates by company, every figure tied to named quarter rolls. These casualty and consumption numbers were read aloud in council each night. Orion trusted my math because the math matched boots, mouths, and miles. She looked at the 9 seats one by one. "If you call this forgery, then call every soldier who counted sacks a liar." Silence met that challenge. Not passive, charged and deciding. The seat that had abstained in the prior split lifted his hand. "Motion for emergency review of the iron claims use in this appointment and of the Chancellor's wartime powers." 5 hands rose, then 6. Vey stood abruptly, chair scraping stone. "You cannot strip emergency authority mid-campaign." Orion answered, voice cold. "Watch us." The review convened at dusk and stretched into night. Statute language was read clause by clause until candle stubs guttered and were replaced. The iron claim had been drafted for battlefield continuity in leader death, not for political humiliation and leash work disguised as necessity. Clerks argued precedent. Captains argued survival. Vey argued central control and painted dissent as weakness. Tamsin spoke once to clarify intent language, then waited. Orion spoke once to affirm command impact, and then yielded floor to records. Sable remained standing through most of it, one hand on the back of a chair as if bracing the room against spin. By second bell, the tribunal suspended Vey's emergency powers pending final adjudication. He left through the side passage without farewell, white fur collar bright as surrender under torchlight. The hall emptied slowly, adrenaline drained, leaving limbs heavy and skin oversensitive. Tamsin carried her maps to the vault because campaign work still had to be done for next movements. Orion followed with the crystal weights and a rolled citation copy tucked under his arm. Inside the vault, cedar and old ink scented the dark. She set the map case down. He set the weights beside it, then did not step back. "You were magnificent," he said, composure cracking enough for heat to show plainly. "I have wanted to touch you for a year." She looked up, pulse kicking. "Only a year?" His laugh came out like a rough cough. "Longer, if I count the convocation minute when you almost fell and I almost forgot an entire room existed." He reached, slower this time, and she met him halfway, palm to jaw first, then mouth to mouth, careful for half a breath, and then not careful at all. His hands framed her ribs, hers gripped his collar and pulled him closer until the map shelf thudded behind him. Desire rose fast, dizzying, fed by months of deferred instinct and sharpened trust. He kissed the corner of her mouth, her throat, came back to her lips like he had practiced restraint so long he no longer knew how to stop once permitted. He lifted her to sit on the edge of the map table, kissing the line beneath her ear. She tugged him between her knees. Breath, teeth, whispered fragments of each other's names. The vault door swung wider on a draft and banged softly once, reminding them where they were and what still stained the law. She pushed at his shoulder. "Not rejection, halt." He stopped instantly, chest heaving. "What?" "The claim," she said, voice raw. "It's suspended, not voided. If we do this now, anyone can say compulsion still shadowed it. They will use that to diminish us, and I won't let them." His forehead rested against hers. He closed his eyes, forced air in and out until his pulse slowed under her palm. "I hate that you're right." "I know." He kissed her once, hard and brief, then stepped back and offered his hand to help her down from the table. She took it. Their fingers stayed linked for 1 second longer than necessary before separating. "Void it first," she said. "Tomorrow," he answered. At the dais, in front of all 9 seats. They left the vault separately by 10 breaths, not from shame but from discipline, each carrying work. She with rolled charts, he with tribunal citations. In the corridor, they passed without touching and without looking away. Dawn broke clear and cold. Frost silvered stair edges and turned breath to smoke in the corridor mouths. Ember dais filled before first bell. No banners this time, only plain standards, and the council seal hung without adornment. Vey returned under summons, stripped of fur and jewels, wearing the same dark robe as any officer under inquiry. He stood between 2 guards and did not meet anyone's eyes. The presiding seat called formal names for testimony in old style. Strategist Tamsin Vale. She stepped onto the brass inlay and spoke to statute intent, coercion risk, and the necessity of free command trust. She did not dramatize humiliation, though everyone in the room remembered it. She described mechanism, seat placement below table level, public diminishment, imposed pairing under emergency claim language. She described outcomes, accurate flood prediction, preserved 1,200 troops. Command function improved when expertise was heard rather than mocked. Her voice stayed level throughout. Only her right hand tightened once around her glove cuff when she referenced the first convocation. Lord Orion Darkhollow. He testified to his own choices and failures without cover. I accepted the claim at convocation because war demanded continuity. I should have challenged misuse immediately. I did not. I challenge it now. He named dates, motions, votes, and command effects. He made no appeal to bloodline. High Chancellor Vey. Vey tried to reframe. The appointment stabilized factions. Discomfort is not coercion. Sable's testimony cut through that with plain steel. It destabilized command until competence forced correction. Then he laid out the quartermaster logs one final time, with duplicate seal evidence and delayed authorizations indexed for all 9 seats. He did not grandstand. He read numbers and dates until even the seats still loyal to Vey stopped interrupting. Debate among the 9 seats lasted less than an hour now that battlefield proof and legal language sat side by side in the same light. Motion to void the iron claim application in this case passed 7-2. Motion to permanently narrow emergency statute scope passed 6-3. Motion to strip Vey of emergency powers and remove him from wartime command authority passed 8-1. 2. The cracked bell rang to seal judgment. Vey left by the main aisle because side exits were denied. No one moved to clear space for him. His robe brushed wet stone where snowmelt had pooled. At the doors, he paused as if expecting someone to call him back, then continued into bright cold air and did not return. When the hall settled, Orion walked down from the council tier to the floor where Tamsin waited. He removed his signet ring and set it on the edge of the brass circle, symbolic only, but clear to every witness. Then he opened both hands. No claim, no compulsion, no statute between them. I ask freely, he said. Kestrel dropped from the rafters in a clean stoop and landed on Tamsin's glove with a scrape of talon against leather, the third return, exactly when steadiness became answer. She smiled, small and fierce. I answer freely. Orion's breath left him in a visible shudder. He stepped close enough to rest his forehead against hers, both of them laughing once, unbelieving and relieved. Kestrel shifted, tucked his wings, and stayed. The room witnessed without jeering this time. One by one, captains struck fist to breastplate in acknowledgement. 2 of the nobles followed, clumsy but sincere. Sable, arms crossed, nodded like a man who had expected this, and still found himself moved by seeing it happen in the same place where it had nearly been broken. By evening, command assignments were rewritten aloud in council, not as tether and heir but as co-strategists with separate authority lanes and shared veto on casualty thresholds. The 9 seats approved by majority. Clerks copied the revisions on thick paper and sanded each line dry. No one asked for a lower stool. The old stool was removed from the chamber entirely before dusk and did not return. In the weeks that followed, the war did not end by miracle. It ended by logistics, timing, and fewer avoidable losses. Crossing points were chosen by depth readings, not display. Reserve grain moved 2 days earlier than tradition. Surrender corridors remained open when terrain allowed. Losses still came. Surgeons still worked by lantern until dawn. Letters still went out to families with names black-lined at top. But fewer men vanished into plans built to satisfy pride. Orion learned to pause before speaking and glance at her maps first. Not because he needed permission, but because he had learned where clarity tended to emerge. Tamsin learned to trust that his restraint was not distance. It was deliberate room for her voice at tables that had once tried to lower her out of sight. Sable remained witness and friction both, as good quartermasters do. He argued over mule counts, cursed optimistic cavalry officers, and once threw a chalk stub at Orion when he tried to approve a march without checking ration burn, Orion threw it back and missed. Tamsin laughed hard enough that she had to sit on a supply crate and wipe tears from her eyes, while Sable pretended offense. Kestrel kept his own schedule. Some mornings he arrived before first bell and perched on the map shelf until she gloved up. Some nights he came late, dropping through the high slit while she and Orion worked casualty projections, and stood one-footed on the edge of an ink tray as if supervising. In storms, he stayed near the rafters over Ember Dais and watched proceedings with that unblinking pale eye. Every return was ordinary by then, which was exactly what steadiness looks like once it becomes part of daily work. They returned often to Ember Dais for councils, and each return rewrote witness memory by repetition rather than speech. The room stayed the same in stone and iron and echo, but authority inside it shifted as decisions accumulated. Captains who had laughed learned to ask for her floodplain read before proposing crossings. Clerks who had copied the iron claim now copied its narrowed language into training statutes. The bell remained cracked and rang anyway. On the first thaw after tribunal, she stood alone at the map table before dawn. The chamber smelled of cold stone, old wax, and wet wool drying by brazier heat. She laid out a new survey sheet and copied flood marks in clean black ink, adding one note at the margin in her mother's shorthand. Depth variance after late ice break, verify by pole before committing heavy wagons. Orion came in without armor, carrying 2 cups of bitter tea. He set one by her elbow, then looked at the chair level with the table and the empty wall space where the lower stool had once leaned. "Do you ever think about that first day?" he asked. She lifted the cup, warmed her fingers, and glanced up at him. "I think about the rung wobbling under my boot. And how you stopped your hand before touching me." She tilted her head. "I hated you for that for at least a week." He winced theatrically. "Only a week?" "Then I saw why you stopped." She traced a flood line with her thumb. "And I realized you were trying to leave me a choice even when the room wasn't." He leaned his hip against the table, close but not crowding, and traced the edge of her map with one knuckle. "I don't want to stop now." "You don't have to." She set the cup down and kissed him once, deliberate and unhurried. Outside, morning drill horns sounded in the yard, followed by the thud of shield practice and shouted cadence. Inside, ink dried on new lines that would keep more people alive next month than Bravado ever had. Kestrel shifted from perch to glove and back again, feathers ruffling at a draft from the high window as if approving the arrangement. When first bell rang, they broke apart and went to work, shoulder to shoulder at full table height in the room where the laughter had started and ended.